Welcome to my Commodore 64 Games memories. This is where I look at old games and some of the technical details behind them. Let's get into it. Today we have Rampage again, but this time there's going to be a little bonus because I realized I forgot to do this last time in the previous video. In the previous video, we saw in this graphics map sprites debug view here where the three player character graphics are kind of pre-calculated or composited into this area of memory here before being copied into the real Vic-drawn hardware sprites. And this composited area has the graphics in a different format, or the bytes are in a different layout compared to the Commodore 64's standard sprites or characters layout. So we need to find out which memory address this is. It's not C400, C440. It's definitely not C480. Let's get out the calculator and calculate this properly. So in this debug view here, we have how many sprites horizontally? It's 16. Of course it's 16 because 16 times 16 is 256. And there are 256 sprites in each Vic bank. So we have 16 sprites times at least, there we go. So we want to be looking at this memory address here, and the next sprite along, and the next sprite along after that is basically the kind of sprite graphics data that we're looking at, but it's not really a sprite, although it's in the sprite area in memory. It's this composited, pre-calculated version of the data. Anyway, so we want to find out the code which calculates graphical data into this area in memory. There we go, that's the sprite that we're looking for. Let's just double check by filling that sprite. There we go, so that's the sprite data that we want to find. I think the sprite composited data was actually like half a sprite beforehand as well. So we'll go backwards a little bit. There we go. This is just so that we can verify that that's the memory range that we want. So let's have a look at what stores into CC80 and then continue on, because that watch point will stop our execution. What we'll be doing is that we'll be tracing backwards through the execution history to find out what calls this routine, which does the compositing or pre-calculation, if you like, for this player character dynamic sprite animation routine anyway. So I'm using the CPU history command here, the CHIS command, with a 40 after it, which means display up to 40 instructions prior to where we are now in the execution history. This is a really excellent feature of the device monitor debugger, because it really does allow you to understand what code was executing before you got to your breakpoint or before you hit your watch point, and it really does help to understand the flow of code. You can then, of course, find a good breakpoint. That looks like an interesting memory address, 89E6. There's a branch on equal, and then it does a whole bunch of code which seems to calculate memory offsets for the sprite data and stuff like that, the animation frame data. So, okay. So the execution history here seems to be state logic. Look, 8A1C there is load A with F369C, and then it does an RTS. ORing together 5 bytes together seems to be like a state test for if all of those bytes are empty, then it returns equal, for example, because it will be all 0. So this looks like a combination of what looks like in the code a state machine for deciding what to do for what animation frames to display based on the internal state, perhaps. And then it's decompressing the animation frames from the animation frame data. In the previous video, we discovered it was at 4000 in hex. There was quite a lot of animation data there. Oh, look at that. So 9DFE, look, it's calling the same routine, but 3 times with x equal to 0, 1, and 2. I wonder if that corresponds to the 3 players. Just adding a little piece of debug text there for anyone watching without subtitles and without audio. We can find out whether or not this is the 3 players. I'm pretty certain it is. That's the gut feeling that I get when I look at this code. So let's quit the game and then let's get the 3 players on the screen. So this was a snapshot that I saved which only had 1 player active. It was useful because then I was able to debug a single pass through the sprite animation frame calculation routine when I was debugging this previously in the previous video. But now we have the game starting again, so we should have 3 players. So let's jump over that first JSR and oh look, the first pre-calculated composited data appears, and then the second player appears, and then the third player. Let's step out because it did a jump rather than a JSR, and there we go. There's the third player composited animation frames. So it's definitely rendering on each call to that routine, either if it's a JSR or a jump, because the jump has an RTS on the end. So instead of doing a JSR and then an immediate RTS after it, which is a return from subroutine, it's just using the RTS at the end of the routine for doing the player calculation. So there we go. 9DFE is the player calculation routine, which is very useful for us to know. So let's step into this routine and see if we can understand it a little bit more. So it's taking a value of y from that 56 memory location, comma x there at 84D5. It's doing some comparisons to make sure that y is in range. 84D1 seems to be like an error trapping test. It was, oh, well, look at that. It's there's some self-modifying code there, which self-modified the JSR address at 84, what was it, EB. That's interesting. Those 4 memory values there, let's have a look at them in the memory view. The memory view, when you zoom in, or when we zoom in, it displays the memory address, and it also displays large hex values that we can see, and also binary values as well, depending on how far you zoom in. So let's delete the breakpoints. Let's let the game run for a little bit while watching that memory view there. I'm just noting down that 84D5 is each player draw calculation routine. These notes, of course, will be added to the rampage.txt debug notes file, and that will, of course, be committed back into source control so that you can also read those notes in source control as well. So I'm just noting down here for your benefit and for my benefit as well what that routine does. So let's go back into the game. Let's watch these memory addresses. Don't forget that it's sequences of 3 bytes, and there are 5 of them, right? 3, 6, 9, C, and F, was it? Something like that. Look at that. Well, they're definitely active in a very obvious pattern. Let's load that snapshot, which only has 1 player character active. And look, as I move the player left and right, these values here change from 0 to 1. As I press up and down, those ones change from 0 to 1 and then back again. And then pressing fire also resulted in that last one going from 0 to 1 as toggles. So it looks like they're left, right, up, down, and fire input bit fields, if you like, although it's a byte for each one. That makes sense. If you want to have the same kind of like player logic routine, then you would separate these values by 3 bytes each for left, right, up, down, and fire in memory. That's certainly one way of doing that, because then you just change the index from 0 to 1 to 2 with an indirected memory read with all of the instructions. So you can reuse the same logic routine for the player for each of the 3 players. So this 84DF routine here seems to load a low and high address and then self-modify that JSR there, which seems to be a state machine. This is where you have a state index and you basically say, I want to jump to this code or JSR to this subroutine as a state. It has to keep on self-modifying the JSR so that the state value gets translated into the address for the jump to subroutine instruction. So, tracing through the code, then it looks like 8A17 always stores 0 when there are no inputs, right? For the because we know that the player, there's only one player left, and it's the one that wasn't doing anything because I wasn't putting in any input in the joystick. Then yeah, it seems that. Okay, so let's put the player here on the screen. Let's instead of 0, let's change that to be 1, and let's see what we get on the screen. Watch carefully. Oh look, cool. So we're displaying a different animation frame, and then there's a different animation frame again. The mouth is opening even more. Maybe he's smiling or grinning. Oh look, jumping right, or starting to jump right. So 8A18 is, it looks like an animation frame that we can modify it to display arbitrary animation frames when the player character is stationary. That's going to get interesting and useful. We can use this. We can modify this code to actually display all of the animation frames that we want, right? That's how we get there. But if we trace backwards through the call stack, for the execution history rather, sorry, yeah, that looks like a good place because it's branch on equal. So it looks like the branch on equal was doing a test for the combined state, right? So we can just put our own code in there to, say, for example, increment 8A18, which was the animation frame number. Let's clamp it so that it goes from 0 to 3F in hex, which is 0 to 63 in decimal. And then let's jump straight to 8A17. And then let's kill the break. There we go. Wow, look, that was easy, wasn't it? The single player character now, which is the ape character, I guess, is now just calculating and cycling through all up to 64 animation frames from 0 to 3F in hex. Isn't that great? So if we pause and then frame advance in the emulator, we can see that, oh, we've got some garbage frames. That's, not unusual. I mean, if the animation frame table doesn't contain all of those animation frames, if the maximum animation frame is less than 63, for example, then it's not going to display properly. But here we go. Look, we can single step through all of the game display for the animation frames. So let's see if we can clear the background graphics. Now, this is how I was able to clear the background graphics to get just the animating sprites for the other part. For the previous video's introduction, I was able to clear the background graphics and then extract just the sprite animation frames, and then use a chroma key for including that into the video. So basically it was masking on black, if you like. So let's fill that character set. There we go. So this is a lot easier to see now. Let's quit the game and then let's restart the game, but have all 3 player characters active. There we go. So this looks like it's hard-coded animation frames at the beginning to display this sequence. And there we go. All three player characters are now cycling through all of their animation frames. So if we single step this in the emulator now, you can see, look, there we go. All of these animation frames can now be extracted. Say, for example, if we took a screenshot of every single frame, then we could more easily extract each animation frame into a paint package or something like that. In theory, we could blank out all of the other sprites for the helicopters and the tanks and everything else. And the bullets, we could get rid of the bullets, characters as well. And then we could cleanly extract, by taking screenshots, all of these animation frames. Also, in theory, we could save each chunk of memory out for the sprites to disk, for example. There are many different ways of doing that. But there we go. That's all. That's the code that we need to change in the game to get the animation frames to cleanly display them. So that was a very short recap or relook into Rampage. I just wanted to cover this because I thought it would be interesting. Thank you very much for watching. Take care. Have a great day wherever you are.